Just one quick follow-up question. Did the rights that workers have in the event that they were sick include typically sick pay as part of their contracts?
Yeah, I suppose the point is that, and it's been suggested that language is a major barrier, and as the Chairman has said, throughout, once somebody comes in and is working in a plant, they first have to go through training, etc.
No, sorry, my question was, do they have sick pay?
Sick pay is in some companies there's a sick pay scheme, in others are not, which is common across the economy, Chairman.
Right, and within the meat industry, would you say the majority of your members or the majority of plants pay sick pay or not?
It's a matter for the individuals. I would say some of them have it, some of them don't, Chairman. But equally, all of the rights, all of the various government measures in terms of the pandemic situation, in terms of the payments and the entitlements, were all briefed in the languages.
I'll ask the same question a third time. Would the majority of your members and the majority of plants represented by Meat Industry Ireland pay sick pay or not?
Chairman, some of them have sick pay schemes and some of them don't.
Right, that's the third time I asked, and the third time you said some do, some don't. I asked whether the majority do or don't, but I'll move on if you don't want to answer the question. Earlier, Mr. Ryan, you correctly pointed out that that workers on a work permit after a year can move to another area of employment. But would you accept that it's very circumscribed where they can move to, that it has to be an area where there's a skills shortage, they have to satisfy all the tests, it costs €1,000 for a new permit, there's an issue about who's going to pay the €1,000, and that it takes 3 or 4 months. And if these are migrants from third countries who are not from the European Union, that there may be a great reluctance to move or to even seek to move.
Thanks, Deputy. In relation, I suppose, to your query on people transferring to other companies or other sectors after a certain period, you're right to point out, as we spoke about earlier, that they are eligible under the current employment permit system to transfer employers after
4 months come up.
In relation, you mentioned the fee and the fee of €1,000 for an application. That is paid in all cases by employers who are obviously looking to recruit individuals. And in relation to potential changes to the employment permit setup, as we've indicated, that's a matter, I suppose, for a different forum for the experts in that area. But any changes made should employ across the board. But there are challenges, as my colleague said earlier on, in relation to skill sets in certain sectors.
There are. The Migrant Rights Centre would dispute that the €1,000 is paid by the employer in all circumstances. That's their evidence here earlier today was the opposite of that. But just moving on to the issue of the temporary wage subsidy scheme, did your members avail of the temporary wage subsidy scheme since it was introduced? And if so, do you have any idea of the numbers of employers, other employees who were employed under the temporary wage subsidy scheme from when it was introduced to date?
A proportion, certainly, Chairman, a proportion of processors, not across the board, and it probably depended on different sectors, but a proportion of them were in the temporary wage scheme. And I know that just from speaking, but I mean it's individual companies participated in the temporary wage support scheme, but certainly a number of companies in the processing sector did, because, well, firstly, they met the requirements, and as Chairman said earlier on, one of the biggest issues, and probably in the beef sector greatest impact because of reliance on food service, was that overnight close down of the food service sector and that market channel, which accounts for 30% of the beef that's exported from Ireland, was gone overnight, effectively, as the virus swept across Europe and country after country brought in lockdown. And that still remains the case, I mean, in terms of food service. But that was one of the biggest factors in terms of both production, and questions were asked earlier on about production levels. I mean, on the beef side, certainly production levels would have fallen quite significantly, I would say, in April and into early May. They've been recovering since, thankfully, but certainly in April and into May, there was a significant reduction in throughput, in processing activity on the beef side, principally because of that food service market channel being gone, which accounted for 30%.
So you talked about a 30% reduction in some instances. What proportion would you say of the workforce in the meat plants were employed under the temporary wage subsidy scheme?
I don't know, Deputy. I mean, I mean, it's not a figure that I've.
You know, but maybe it's a figure you could provide. Is it a figure that you maybe could consult with your members and provide to the committee again within 10 working days, or if that's an unreasonable period of time, perhaps even 20. We're heading into the summer. Very little happens in this house. Unlike maybe the business community, very little happens here during August. So maybe it's a figure you could get.
Yeah, well, I'll try and do that, Deputy. I mean, as I said, it was individual companies who applied for that.
I have to put it to you that notwithstanding the...
It will be, and they will be published in time anyway, so yeah, I can try and assist on that.
Ill figures published by the Department of Agriculture in any given week this year were no lower than 5% lower than this time last year.
Sorry, Deputy, is that production?
Kill figures that are produced by the Department of Agriculture, and I've looked at them. In week 23 it was 72,000 this year as opposed to 76 last year. The next week it was 76 as opposed to 80. It was 79 as opposed to 83. So the fall off in kill is relatively low compared to last year. Now, I'd accept it might be a different type of animal was killed, it might be less geared towards a premium market, but you were still killing substantial amounts of cattle while the state may or may not, and I'd be very interested in the figures that you'll be able to provide to us, while the state was paying perhaps large sums of money under the temporary COVID wage subsidy scheme. Yeah,
I don't know which figures you're referring to.
The Department of Agriculture website.
But the annual, the weekly cattle
figures, yeah.
Slaughtering figures in the country as reported by the Department of Agriculture in early March probably would have been in the region of 35 to 37,000 head per week across the country. Those dropped rapidly and I think reached about 25,000 head per week for quite a number of weeks before starting to increase again. So I'm not sure which figures you have, but those are the Department of Agriculture weekly cattle slaughtering figures.
Okay. Well, I mean, look, I may have misread them, or they're the figures that I was looking at, but I may have been looking at a cumulative figure, but I don't think the drop-off was as dramatic as one might have expected. I mean, there was a beef intervention scheme going on as well, but was that utilised by the Irish sector?
Yeah, you know, you're right, Chairman, beef private storage scheme. Yeah. No, I think there was an application for perhaps 20 tonnes. I mean, it was a scheme of 25,000 tonnes that was announced by the European Commission. But we had made a point throughout that it was a scheme that wasn't going to work, it wasn't suited, I think, without, you know, I mean, we're going into other areas, but it was structured that, you know, you needed to put almost the entire carcass into it when probably you had an outlet for some of the cuts from the animal into retail or whatever, but this was requiring you to put everything into it. It was also at aid rates that weren't very significant, because one of the things you do is you're freezing it down once you go in there, and it devalues. So for that reason it wasn't really picked up across Europe, and actually I just saw that today it's been that overall measure has been closed by the European Commission. But I'm happy to come back on those figures, because...
No, I mean, I can give them to you. The cumulative beef kill, including the week commencing the 29th of the 6th, 2020, is 906,174. And last year, including the week commencing the 1st of July, 2019, is 939,100. Now that is a reduction, but I think it's a 5% reduction. If I give her, I mean, I'm.
Yeah, but I think that, I mean, and yeah, cumulative accepted, and I'll happily, you know, go through those figures. But I do know from the period from mid-April to mid-May, or perhaps early April to mid-May, you saw a rapid reduction in cattle numbers processed in the country. It would have been at, and the weekly generally is 35,000 or so, it would have been at levels of 37,000 and fell to 25,000 for quite a number of weeks, and I'm sure those weekly ones will show up there, but they are as published, as you say, by the Department of Agriculture.
I think they've already been accounted for. But anyway, we can park that. One last thing, Mr. Healy, you agreed that Meat Industry Ireland would meet with SIP2 in response to Deputy Duncan Smith's line of questioning. But you equally correctly point out that, of course, you're a representative body of a number of different firms. It does seem that there are a number of reports that suggest, including this European Federation of Food, Agriculture and Tourism Trade Unions, that SIP2 is affiliated to, and its report on outbreaks of COVID in a number of countries, certainly not limited to Ireland by any stretch, but says in respect of Ireland, access to site for trade unions is also extremely challenging. Now, Ms Dáil McGinley of the Migrant Rights Centre spoke about workers being afraid to be seen to be either joining trade unions, talking to trade unions, or talking to the Migrant Rights Centre, really talking to anybody about their rights. While you, Meat Industry Ireland, might be prepared to talk to trade unions, do you think that your members are going to be willing to allow trade unions into their workplaces? Chairman,
trade union involvement on the meat industry, in the meat industry, has been in existence for many years. And actually, you know, the contrary to your point, the point that we had made to SIP2 is that MII as an organisation and a representative body in terms of the areas that we have worked on wasn't and isn't one in relation to employment and labour matters, and was best dealt with at local level. And I know there are where there is union involvement in plants, in companies, they have been engaged and they have been working with management, and even, I mean, one of the deputies referred to a letter from one of the unions to the minister. There even have been ones in more recent times in support of measures that have been in place. So, you know, the members have an engagement with unions at local level, and that was my point to SIP2 at the time, that that was the main focus of attention.
So you wouldn't agree with the general line that access to sites for trade unions is extremely challenging? You would disagree with that point?
Yeah, I mean that's not. I mean, and I don't know where it fits in all of this, Chairman, either. But I wouldn't agree with that point, because, as I said, there is a union involvement in the meat industry for many years. It may vary in level, you know, in the extent of it throughout, as it does across the economy. So
the independent trade union, and they're primarily based in the south of the country, made a similar submission that independent workers union, that you know, there's certainly, reading their submission, it would seem that their view is, they may be wrong, of course, and you're perfectly entitled to dispute this, but they would suggest that trade union membership and trade union activism is something that's not very welcomed on the floor of your members' premises. But again, you're welcome to dispute that.
Absolutely, and we'll dispute that, but it's also the point, Chairman, too, in terms of the Special Committee on COVID, and in terms of the industry's response on it. The focus is primarily in terms of ensuring that we get to a situation where we are now, where there's 0 cases, and maintain.
Absolutely, and sorry, and I don't wish to.
You know, we're you know, going on to other areas.
Oh, yeah, no, I completely, and I don't wish to stray from.
Would have worked on and would have engaged in.
Yeah, no, just to make clear, I don't wish to stray from our terms of reference, but I suppose the central accusation here today is that the terms and conditions around sick pay and around the working conditions for workers, in particular migrant workers, are such that required them to work in dangerous circumstances, which resulted in them contracting COVID. And I suppose that's what we're investigating. So that's how this whole issue of trade union membership links to the issue of COVID response. It's not as separate and divorced as might appear at first instance.
Can I just answer that very quickly and say to you that everybody has said right across the board, the experts now I'm talking about, have said that COVID-19 is an insidious and indiscriminate virus. It doesn't discriminate between people who are on modest levels of pay and people who are on high levels of pay. It doesn't discriminate across the nationality of people. It doesn't discriminate across borders.
No, but I think, David...
So to suggest, for example, that there are issues around health and safety in plants, when health and safety is inspected in the normal course without announcement in advance, but is inspected by a state authority, I think that needs to be refuted, because it is simply not the case.
Sorry, what needs to be refuted? Thank you. I know I'm anxious to...
The fact that there are suggestions being made, you said it yourself, Chairman, about the standard of health and safety in plants. What I'm saying to you is that the standard of health and safety in plants is regulated by the HSA, a state body, independent of the plants, and on a regular basis.
No, I just invited you to respond to that, and I thank you very much for doing that. Lastly, and very lastly, it's a very net point, did you say that the accommodation that workers live in is inspected by the WRC, or was that a miss? Obviously, workplace environments, etc., can be, and the terms and conditions under which people work, but are the actual... Did one of you say that the accommodation is inspected by the WRC?
I'll take that one, Chair. And no, I didn't say that. What I said was, I suppose, in the context of the employment permit system, one of the requirements of the system is that accommodation assistance is provided in sourcing accommodation. That accommodation is not mandatory. It doesn't have to be availed of, and people often move on. But as part of the requirements of the permit system, there is a requirement that assistance is given in sourcing it, and it is that element of it that is inspected by the WRC, to the best of my knowledge.